Coffee spilled across the linoleum floor, pooling near a pair of polished Italian leather shoes. Sophie scrambled to clean the mess, her tired eyes catching a heavy platinum ring on the man's hand. She whispered the innocent words that would shatter 2 decades of carefully buried secrets and awaken a sleeping empire. Rain battered the greasy window panes of Sal's all-night diner on Wabash Avenue, distorting the neon glow of the streetlights into streaks of fractured crimson and gold. It was 3 a.m. in Chicago, the hour when the city's ghosts crawled out from the sewers to mingle with the insomniacs. Arthur Costello sat in the back corner booth, his broad shoulders resting against the peeling red vinyl. He was a man composed of sharp angles and cold calculation, the undisputed head of the Costello syndicate. Tonight, however, he was just a tired man seeking refuge in the bitter sludge of diner coffee. Across the room, his bodyguard Gabriel sat near the entrance, pretending to read a newspaper while his eyes tracked every shadow that moved past the glass door. It had been a long, brutal week. The ongoing turf war with the Romano family had cost Arthur 2 warehouses, 4 loyal men, and whatever little sleep he usually managed to salvage. He needed this quiet moment, this solitary sanctuary, where the scent of old frying grease overpowered the metallic stench of the underworld. Sophie Bennett wiped her hands on a stained white apron, suppressing a yawn that threatened to crack her jaw. At 22, she was carrying the weight of a lifetime. Between her mother's mounting medical bills and the suffocating rent for their cramped apartment in Pilsen, working the graveyard shift was not a choice. It was survival. She picked up the aluminum coffee pot, her sensible sneakers squeaking against the damp floor as she made her rounds. She approached the man in the back booth. He was a regular of sorts, appearing randomly every few months, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. He tipped exorbitantly, spoke in a gravelly, quiet voice, and wore suits that cost more than she made in a year. Sophie didn't know his name, nor did she want to. In Chicago, you learned early that curiosity was a luxury the poor could not afford. "Refill, sir?" Sophie asked, offering a polite, exhausted smile. Arthur looked up, his deep-set gray eyes locking onto hers. There was a profound exhaustion in his gaze, a hollow emptiness that made Sophie instinctively take a half-step back. "Please," he murmured, his voice a low rumble over the hiss of the diner's ventilation system. He shifted his arm on the formica table to make room for her to pour. As he did, his cuff-linked sleeve pulled back, revealing his left hand. Sophie leaned in, tilting the heavy pot, but her hand trembled. A splash of scalding black coffee missed the rim of the porcelain mug, splattering onto the table and dripping down toward his pristine leather shoes. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," Sophie gasped, immediately dropping the pot onto the table and frantically grabbing a handful of cheap paper napkins from the dispenser. She dropped to her knees, dabbing at the floor near his shoes, her face burning with humiliation. "I'm so sorry. I'll pay for the cleaning. It's just been a long night." "Leave it," Arthur said, his tone devoid of anger. He reached down, grasping her forearm to stop her frantic scrubbing. His grip was surprisingly gentle, yet unyielding. As his hand closed over her wrist, Sophie froze. Her eyes were suddenly transfixed, not by his grip, but by the heavy piece of metal resting on his ring finger. It was a massive, custom-made platinum signet ring. In its center sat a smooth piece of black onyx, and embedded within the stone was a silver crest, a chimera with a broken wing, clutching a singular rose in its jaws. Sophie's breath hitched. She blinked, staring at the ring as if it were an apparition. The details were too precise, too completely identical to the one object she had spent her childhood marveling over in secret. "Is there a problem?" Arthur asked, narrowing his eyes as he noticed the blood drain from the young waitress's face. He let go of her arm, sitting back, instantly on high alert. Across the room, Gabriel folded his newspaper, his hand subtly drifting toward the inside of his jacket. Sophie stood up slowly, her mind racing, clutching the damp napkins against her chest. She looked from the ring to Arthur's hardened face, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't thinking about the danger, nor the rules of the city. She was only thinking about the velvet box hidden in her mother's nightstand. "Sir," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the hum of the diner like a siren. My mother has a ring exactly like yours." For a second, the universe seemed to pause. The rain stopped hitting the glass. The coffee pot stopped steaming. Arthur Costello, a man who had stared down the barrels of loaded guns without blinking, physically stopped breathing. He stared at the girl, a slow, icy dread creeping up his spine, mingling with a violent, impossible spark of hope. The ring on his finger was not a mass-produced piece of jewelry. It was forged in Naples in 1999 by a master jeweler who was executed 2 days later to ensure no replicas could ever be made. There were only 2 rings in existence. Arthur wore the chimera facing left. The other, the chimera facing right, had been slipped onto the delicate finger of his wife, Lucia, on their wedding day. Lucia, who had burned to death in a warehouse explosion set by the Romanos 23 years ago. Arthur's face turned into a mask of stone, but his hands, hidden beneath the table, shook violently. He leaned forward, the sudden, terrifying intensity radiating from him, causing Sophie to stumble backward. "What did you just say?" Arthur demanded, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a lethal, jagged thing. I'm sorry," Sophie stammered, terrified by the sudden shift in his demeanor. The quiet, melancholic man was gone, replaced by a predator. "I shouldn't have said anything. It's just a coincidence." "Do not move," Arthur commanded. He slid out of the booth, his tall frame towering over her. Gabriel was instantly at his side, eyes scanning the perimeter, but Arthur ignored his bodyguard. He grabbed Sophie's shoulders, his grip tight, almost desperate. "Look at me. Where is the ring? The one your mother has." "She keeps it in a box," Sophie cried softly, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "She told me it belonged to my father. He died before I was born. Please, let me go. I'm sorry." "Your father," Arthur breathed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the girl's face, really looked at her. He saw the slope of her nose, the stubbornly defiant set of her jaw, the hazel eyes that looked exactly like God. They looked exactly like Lucia's. He was doing the math in his head. The explosion was 23 years ago. The girl in front of him looked to be in her early 20s. If Lucia had somehow survived the fire, if she had fled, she would have been pregnant. Arthur's chest tightened painfully. 23 years of mourning. 23 years of visiting an empty casket filled with ashes that weren't even hers. 23 years of waging a bloody, scorched earth war against the Romano family to avenge a ghost. "Gabriel," Arthur barked, never taking his eyes off Sophie. "Boss, buy the diner. Give the manager whatever he wants in the register and tell him the waitress is done for the night." Sophie panicked. No, I need this job. You can't do this." "You don't need this job anymore," Arthur said, his voice softening just a fraction, a terrifying tenderness bleeding through the steel. "Get your coat. You're going to take me to your mother right now." The interior of the black Lincoln Navigator was suffocatingly silent. The thick, bulletproof glass completely muted the violent Chicago storm raging outside, leaving only the soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic thumping of Sophie's racing heart. She sat rigidly in the plush leather seat, her damp coat pulled tight around her small frame. Next to her, Arthur Costello sat like a statue carved from granite. He stared straight ahead at the rain-slicked streets, his hands resting on his knees. Every few moments, his left thumb would rhythmically trace the edge of his obsidian ring. In the driver's seat, Gabriel steered the heavy SUV toward Pilsen with practiced precision. He had been with Arthur for 15 years and had never seen the boss like this. Arthur was a man of logic and ruthless pragmatism. He didn't chase ghosts. Yet, here they were, speeding through the night, based on the panicked stammering of a diner waitress. "What is your mother's name?" Arthur asked suddenly, breaking the silence. He didn't turn his head. Sophie swallowed hard. Her instincts screamed at her to lie, to open the door at the next red light and run. But the men in the front seat radiated an authority that told her running would be fatal. "Laura," she whispered. "Laura Bennett." Arthur closed his eyes. Laura, not Lucia. A fake name. A fresh start. It made sickening sense. If Lucia had survived the ambush that night, she would have known that staying with Arthur meant a life in the crosshairs. The Romanos had targeted her specifically to break him. If she realized she was pregnant, the instinct to protect her unborn child would have overridden everything else. She would have used the chaos of the fire to disappear into the ash, letting him believe she was dead. The betrayal stung, a hot, searing pain in his chest, but it was quickly eclipsed by a tsunami of frantic, desperate hope. She was alive. The woman he had loved with a dangerous, all-consuming passion was breathing the same air in the same city. And the girl sitting next to him, Arthur, forced himself not to look at Sophie. If he looked at her again, if he fully accepted the reality that he was sitting next to his own flesh and blood, his daughter, he feared he would completely unravel. "Is she well?" Arthur asked, his voice strained. "Your mother?" Sophie hesitated, confused by the sudden vulnerability in this terrifying man's voice. "No," she answered honestly. "She's sick. She's been sick for a long time. It's her heart. That's why I work the nights. For her medication." Arthur's jaw tightened, so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. His wife was dying in a rundown apartment in Pilsen, relying on their daughter to sling cheap coffee in the middle of the night to afford medication, while he sat on millions of dollars, just 10 miles away. The injustice of it, the cruel irony, made him want to rip the doors off the vehicle. "Take the next left, Gabriel. Step on it," Arthur ordered roughly. "We're here," Sophie murmured a few minutes later, pointing to a decaying brick building squeezed between a boarded-up pawn shop and a liquor store with iron bars on the windows. The street lamp outside flickered wildly, casting long, menacing shadows across the crumbling sidewalk. Gabriel pulled the navigator onto the curb, throwing the vehicle into park. He unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for the door handle, but Arthur stopped him with a sharp gesture. "You stay here. Keep the engine running. Keep your eyes open," Arthur commanded. He turned to Sophie. "Show me the way." Sophie nodded, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the handle. She stepped out into the freezing rain, leading the tall, imposing mob boss into the dimly lit vestibule of the apartment complex. The air smelled of stale cigarettes, wet dog, and boiling cabbage. Arthur followed her up 3 flights of stairs, the rotting wood groaning under his weight. His mind was a battlefield. How would he look at her? What would he say? "I thought you were dead. I slaughtered 20 men to avenge you. I mourned you every single day." Would she run from him? Would she hate him for bringing the darkness back to her doorstep? They reached the 4th floor. The hallway was illuminated by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "It's number 4B, Sophie said quietly, digging into her coat pocket for her keys. She walked down the narrow hall, her sneakers squelching slightly. Arthur walked a few paces behind her, feeling his breath hitch in his throat. 23 years. It was all behind this door. Sophie pulled her key out and reached for the knob. Before the metal key could slide into the lock, her hand froze. The door wasn't fully closed. It was sitting ajar by about an inch. The lock splintered. The cheap wood around the hinges cracked. Arthur's instincts, honed by decades of paranoia and violence, flared instantly. The romantic reunion shattered, replaced by cold, hard adrenaline. He stepped forward, grabbing Sophie's shoulder and violently yanking her behind him, shielding her body with his own. With his right hand, Arthur drew a suppressed 9mm pistol from the holster beneath his jacket in a single, fluid motion. He pushed the door open with the toe of his shoe. It swung wide, hitting the interior wall with a hollow thud. The apartment was pitch black, save for the weak amber light from the street lamp filtering through the blinds. Arthur stepped inside, his gun raised, his eyes sweeping the small living room. "Lucia?" he called out. The name he hadn't spoken aloud in 2 decades, tearing from his throat. Silence answered him. He reached out and flipped the light switch. The overhead light flickered on, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The small, modest apartment had been completely ransacked. The sofa cushions were slashed open, cheap stuffing spilling onto the worn carpet like fresh snow. The coffee table was overturned, shattered glass from a broken lamp glittering on the floor. Sophie pushed past Arthur's arm, letting out a blood-curdling scream. "Mom!" She ran into the small adjacent bedroom. Arthur followed her, his weapon steady, his heart turning to ice. The bedroom was in a similar state of ruin. The mattress was flipped off the box spring. The drawers of the cheap dresser were pulled out and thrown across the room. Clothes were everywhere. But there was no blood. And there was no Lucia. Sophie fell to her knees next to the bedside table, which had been smashed to pieces. Amidst the splintered wood and scattered pill bottles, an elegant dark blue velvet box lay open and completely empty. "She's gone," Sophie sobbed, her hands hovering over the empty box. "The ring is gone. My mother is gone." Arthur stood in the center of the ruined bedroom, the gun heavy in his hand. He looked at the empty velvet box, and a slow, murderous realization washed over him. This wasn't a robbery. A street thug wouldn't know the value of that specific ring. A street thug wouldn't slash cushions looking for hidden documents. Only someone who knew the truth about Laura Bennett would orchestrate this. Only someone who knew she was Lucia Costello, the wife of the city's biggest mafia boss. Arthur pulled out his phone, dialing Gabriel's number. "Boss?" Gabriel answered immediately. "Call the men." "All of them," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, dead calm. The kind of calm that preceded a massacre. "Lock down the city. The airports, the trains, the highways. Nobody leaves Chicago." "What happened? Who are we looking for?" Gabriel asked, sensing the apocalyptic shift in his boss's tone. Arthur looked down at Sophie, who was weeping uncontrollably on the floor, mourning the mother she had just lost, completely unaware that she had just found her father. "Victor Romano," Arthur said, speaking the name of his oldest rival, the man he thought he had broken years ago. "He didn't finish the job in 03. He just took my wife. And God help him, because I am going to burn his entire world to the ground to get her back." The iron gates of the Costello estate in Lake Forest parted like the jaws of a leviathan, swallowing the black SUV into the sprawling, manicured grounds. The storm had followed them from the city, unleashing sheets of freezing rain against the stone facade of the 30-room mansion. For Sophie Bennett, the transition from her crumbling Pilsen apartment to this palatial fortress felt like slipping into a fever dream. Gabriel killed the engine. The silence in the car was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and terrifying realities. "Get out," Arthur said, his voice ragged. It wasn't a command. It was a plea from a man struggling to keep his composure. Sophie didn't move. She clutched the door handle, her knuckles white. "Where are we? Who are you? You said you would help me find my mother, but you just ordered a lockdown of the city like you own it." She swallowed, her voice trembling but defiant. "Are you the Mafia? Is that why my mother's apartment looked like a war zone?" Arthur turned in his seat. The dim interior lights caught the harsh lines of his face, the scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the brutal set of his jaw. But his eyes, usually cold and impenetrable, were brimming with a terrifying, raw sorrow. "I am Arthur Costello," he said quietly, the name hanging in the air like a loaded gun. Sophie gasped, shrinking back against the leather seat. Even in the insulated poverty of her life, she knew that name. Everyone in Chicago knew that name. It was whispered in back alleys and plastered across federal indictments that never seemed to stick. He was the ghost that ruled the city's underworld. "My mother is a waitress," Sophie cried, her panic rising. "She's a sick woman who watches soap operas and knits. She has nothing to do with you people. Why would Victor Romano want her?" "Because," Arthur said, his voice breaking slightly, "your mother's name isn't Laura Bennett, it's Lucia Costello. And 23 years ago, she was my wife." The word struck Sophie with the force of a physical blow. The air vanished from her lungs. She stared at him, desperately searching for the lie, the cruel joke. But she only found her own hazel eyes staring back at her from a face hardened by decades of violence. "No," Sophie whispered, shaking her head. "My father died in a car crash before I was born. She showed me his grave." "A lie," Arthur said softly, reaching out slowly, deliberately, and turning on the overhead cabin light. "Look at me, Sophie. Really look at me." She did. She looked at the slope of his nose, the square cut of his jaw, the dark, wavy hair graying at the temples. She looked at the shape of his hands, the same long, deft fingers that she possessed. Then her eyes fell back to the platinum ring on his left hand, the chimera and the rose. "It's a family quarrel, sweetheart," her mother had told her years ago, sitting on the edge of her childhood bed, holding the matching ring. "It means that even monsters can protect something beautiful. You." Sophie choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "You're my father." "I am," Arthur confirmed, the two words costing him every ounce of his legendary control. "And I thought you both burned to ashes 23 years ago at the old shipyard. I buried an empty casket. I waged a war that stained this city red for a decade to avenge her. If she ran, if she hid you from me, she did it because she knew the Romanos would never stop hunting her to get to me. And now they found her." Sophie sobbed, the reality crashing down on her. The mother she loved, the woman who had scrubbed floors and ruined her health to keep them safe, was currently in the hands of monsters. "You brought this to our door. If you hadn't come to the diner—" "They didn't track me from the diner," Arthur interrupted, his tone shifting back to the cold, calculating syndicate boss. "They've been watching her, waiting for a moment of weakness. Victor Romano is a coward, but he is patient. He took her to draw me out, to finish what he started." Arthur pushed his door open and stepped out into the rain. He looked back at her, his silhouette framed by the sprawling mansion. "I couldn't protect her then, Sophie. But I swear to you on my life, and on the blood that runs in both our veins, I will bring her back tonight. Now, come inside. You need to be safe." The interior of the Costello mansion was a jarring contrast to the violence of Arthur's world. It was quiet, filled with classical art, warm mahogany, and the scent of lemon oil. Arthur led Sophie to a massive study, where three men in tailored suits were already waiting. "Boss," said a tall, broad-shouldered man with a broken nose. This was Leo, Arthur's underboss. "Give me the sitrep, Leo," Arthur demanded, shedding his wet coat and throwing it onto a leather armchair. He walked to a heavy oak desk and pulled open a drawer, retrieving a Beretta 92 FS. He checked the magazine with practiced, terrifying efficiency. "We have eyes on the Romano family's known fronts. The clubs in River North are empty. The meatpacking fronts in Fulton Market are locked down tight," Leo reported, his eyes darting to Sophie, who stood shivering near the doorway. "Who's the girl Artie?" "She is my daughter," Arthur stated. The absolute authority in his voice left no room for questions. The three mobsters froze, staring at Sophie as if she were a ghost, before respectfully lowering their eyes. "And Victor Romano has my wife." The room's temperature seemed to plummet. "We got a ping, boss," Gabriel said, stepping into the study with a laptop. He placed it on the desk. "One of our rats inside Victor's crew just sent a panic text. He said Victor moved a high-value package to the old industrial laundry facility out in Cicero, the one off South Laramie." Arthur stared at the screen. The industrial laundry facility. It was a massive concrete labyrinth, heavily fortified and practically soundproof. It was exactly the kind of place Victor would choose for a final stand. "Gather the strike team," Arthur ordered, his voice echoing with lethal intent. "Suppressors on everything. We go in quiet. We clear the rooms, and we don't leave a single Romano man breathing. If Victor is there, I want him alive. He's mine." He turned to Sophie, his eyes softening marginally. "Stay here. Gabriel will guard the door. I will bring your mother home." "Don't let her die," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I just found out who you are. Don't let me lose her on the same night." Arthur crossed the room, placing a heavy, warm hand on her shoulder. "I lost her once, Sophie. God himself couldn't make me lose her twice." The storm had escalated into a torrential downpour by the time the three black armored vans cut their headlights, rolling to a silent halt 3 blocks away from the Cicero laundry facility. The building was a hulking, brutalist monstrosity, its windows blacked out, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Arthur stepped out into the freezing mud, pulling the collar of his tactical jacket up against the driving rain. He was flanked by 12 of his most lethal enforcers, ghosts dressed in black Kevlar. "We move in 3 teams," Arthur signaled, with sharp hand gestures. "Leo, take the loading docks. Vincent, breach the roof access. I take the front." They moved with the synchronized precision of a military unit. The Costello Syndicate hadn't survived the brutal Chicago gang wars by being sloppy. They were apex predators. Arthur approached the main entrance. 2 Romano guards were stationed just inside the heavy glass doors, smoking cigarettes and laughing, completely oblivious to the specter of death approaching from the dark. Arthur didn't hesitate. He raised his suppressed Beretta. Pfft, pfft. The glass didn't shatter. The specialized rounds punched clean holes through the pane, dropping both guards instantly before their cigarettes even hit the floor. Arthur kicked the door open, stepping over the bodies. "Clear the perimeter," he whispered into his earpiece. "Loading dock is clear," Leo's voice crackled. "Roof access secured." "We're heading down the stairwell," Vincent reported. Arthur moved through the dark, cavernous main floor of the laundry facility. Massive industrial washing machines loomed like dormant iron beasts. The smell of bleach and stale water was overpowering. He kept his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the shadows. Every step he took was fueled by 23 years of repressed agony. He thought of Lucia. He thought of the way she used to laugh, throwing her head back, the sound filling their first cramped apartment in Little Italy. He thought of the way she smelled of vanilla and gunpowder. He thought of the empty velvet box in that ruined Pilsen apartment. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the east wing. "Contact! We have contact in the administrative hallway," Leo yelled over the comms. The distinct, deafening roar of unsuppressed automatic weapons echoed through the concrete facility. The element of surprise was gone. "Hold them down," Arthur growled, breaking into a sprint. He didn't head toward the gunfire. He headed toward the center of the facility. Victor was a coward. He wouldn't be on the front lines. He would be in the safest, most fortified room in the building. The manager's office. Arthur rounded a corner and came face to face with 3 Romano enforcers. They raised their weapons, but Arthur was faster. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. Chest, chest, head stepping over their falling bodies without breaking his stride. His face was a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. He reached the heavy steel door of the manager's office at the end of the corridor. It was locked. Arthur didn't bother trying the handle. He aimed at the locking mechanism and emptied the rest of his magazine into the metal, the deafening cracks echoing in the narrow hallway. He kicked the door with the heel of his boot, sending it flying inward. The office was brightly lit, a stark contrast to the gloom outside. And there, sitting behind a cheap metal desk, was Victor Romano. Victor looked older than Arthur remembered. His hairline had receded, his face deeply lined with the stress of a losing war. But his eyes still held that same venomous, arrogant spark. He held a silver revolver, the barrel pressed firmly against the temple of the woman kneeling beside his chair. Arthur's heart completely stopped. Lucia. She was thinner, her dark hair streaked with silver, her face bruised and pale. She wore a faded hospital gown beneath a cheap winter coat, shivering violently. But when she looked up, her eyes the exact same hazel as Sophie's met Arthur's. Time collapsed. The decades vanished. "Arthur," she breathed, a ragged, desperate sound. "Drop the gun, Victor," Arthur commanded, his voice eerily calm as he ejected his spent magazine and slammed a fresh one home in a fraction of a second, raising the weapon dead level with Victor's eyes. "Look at you," Victor spat, a nervous sweat beading on his forehead. "The great Arthur Costello. You spent 20 years tearing my family apart piece by piece, burning my shipments, slaughtering my brothers, all for a ghost." Victor let out a dry, manic laugh. "And the punchline? The ghost was just hiding in Pilsen, playing house." "I won't tell you again, Victor," Arthur said softly, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Take the gun off my wife." "Or what?" Victor sneered, though his hand trembled slightly against Lucia's head. "You shoot me." My finger twitches, and she paints the floor. "I didn't grab her to kill her, Artie. I grabbed her to watch you beg. I want my territory back. I want the docks, I want the River North clubs, and I want a safe passage out of Chicago. You sign it all over right now, or you can bury her for real this time." Arthur stared at Victor, his mind racing through trajectories, calculating the tension in Victor's trigger finger, the angle of the shot. It was too risky. If he missed by a millimeter, Lucia died. "You think I care about territory?" Arthur asked, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room. "You think I care about clubs and docks? You took the only thing in this world that mattered to me. And you think you're walking out of here with a real estate deal? Stop walking." Victor screamed, panic finally breaking through his arrogance. He jammed the barrel harder against Lucia's temple. She let out a sharp cry of pain. That sound, Lucia's cry, snapped the last thread of Arthur's restraint. He didn't shoot Victor. Instead, Arthur instantly lowered his weapon and shot the heavy, glass-cased fire extinguisher mounted on the wall directly behind Victor's head. The pressurized tank exploded with the force of a bomb, sending a blinding, deafening cloud of thick white chemical foam erupting into the room. Victor screamed, blinded and startled by the blast, his grip faltering for a microsecond as he instinctively recoiled. In that microsecond, Arthur crossed the room. He didn't fire his weapon through the smoke. It was too dangerous. He lunged into the white cloud, his massive hand finding Victor's wrist. He twisted it violently upward. A sickening crack echoed in the room, followed by Victor's agonizing shriek as the silver revolver clattered to the floor. Arthur grabbed Victor by the throat, slamming him backward onto the metal desk with bone-shattering force. He pressed his forearm against Victor's windpipe, completely cutting off his air, while his other hand brought the Beretta up beneath Victor's chin. The white chemical smoke began to settle, revealing the pure, murderous intent in Arthur's eyes. "You don't get a deal," Arthur whispered, the words a death sentence. "You get to go to hell, and tell your brothers that Arthur Costello sent you." He pulled the trigger. The deafening silence that followed the gunshot was heavier than the gunfire that preceded it. Arthur stood up slowly, stepping back from the desk. The leader of the Romano family was dead, and with him, a 20-year war finally burned itself out into ash. Arthur let his gun drop to his side, his chest heaving. He turned around slowly. Lucia was still kneeling on the floor, covered in white foam, shaking uncontrollably. Arthur dropped to his knees in front of her. He didn't care about the blood on his hands or the ruin around them. He reached out, his hands trembling violently, and gently cupped her face. She flinched for a second, a conditioned response to violence, before she leaned into his touch, letting out a choked sob. "Lucia," Arthur choked out, tears finally breaking through his iron facade, cutting clean tracks through the soot on his face. "My God, Lucia." "I'm sorry," she wept, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in the thick Kevlar of his vest. "I'm so sorry, Arthur. I had to run. They were going to kill the baby. I found out I was pregnant 2 days before the warehouse fire. I knew if I stayed, they would never stop coming for her. I had to make you believe we were dead so you wouldn't come looking." Arthur wrapped his arms around her fragile frame, burying his face in her hair. It smelled of cheap diner coffee and fear, but beneath it all, it was still her. "You protected her," he whispered fiercely. "You kept her safe. You did what I couldn't." He pulled back slightly, looking deeply into her eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the dark blue velvet box Sophie had found empty. He opened it, revealing the platinum ring with the chimera facing right. He had taken it off a dead Romano enforcer in the hallway moments earlier. Gently, he took Lucia's left hand and slid the heavy ring back onto her finger, where it belonged. It sat perfectly next to his own. "Let's go home," Arthur said, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. The storm had passed by the time Arthur's armored SUV pulled back through the iron gates of the Lake Forest estate. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, casting pale rays of gold across the wet lawns. Sophie was sitting on the grand staircase in the foyer, her knees pulled up to her chest, exhausted and terrified. When the heavy front doors opened, she leaped to her feet. Arthur walked in, carrying Lucia. "Mom!" Sophie screamed, sprinting across the marble floor. Arthur gently set Lucia down, keeping an arm around her waist to support her. Mother and daughter collided in a desperate, tearful embrace, sinking to the floor in a tangle of limbs and sobs. Arthur stepped back, watching them. The emptiness that had gnawed at his soul for over 2 decades was suddenly, overwhelmingly full. He had spent his life building an empire of fear, accumulating power and wealth in a desperate attempt to fill the void Lucia had left behind. But watching the 2 women weep on the floor of his foyer, he realized that all the power in Chicago was worthless compared to the fragile, beating hearts in front of him. Lucia looked up from Sophie's shoulder, her eyes meeting Arthur's. She reached out a trembling hand toward him. Arthur knelt beside them, enveloping them both in his massive arms. He pressed a kiss to Sophie's forehead, then to Lucia's temple. "No more running," Arthur promised them, his voice thick with emotion, but absolute in its conviction. "No more hiding. You are Costello's, and no one in this world will ever touch you again." Sophie looked at her mother, then at the terrifying, powerful man who had turned a city upside down in a single night just to bring them back together. She saw the matching rings on their hands, the chimera and the rose, finally reunited. The diner, the poverty, the midnight, shifts it all felt like a lifetime ago. The waitress was gone. The daughter of the syndicate had finally come home. The war with the Romanos ended not with a fiery explosion, but with a quiet gunshot in a damp warehouse. Arthur Costello reclaimed his stolen world, learning that true empire wasn't built on blood and fear, but on the fragile, beating hearts of the women he loved. Sophie finally traded the diner's midnight shadows for a family's fierce protection. The chimera had found its missing rose, at last.